Remember capitalism. Of course, death is not the only defeat. Death is defeat's common abstract referent. Last time on Yu-Gi-Oh! I showed you algebra. I think you're ready for calculus. Remember a nerd, a Luddite nerd, a card game Luddite nerd. This isn't Yu-Gi-Oh! We're imagining Yu-Gi-Oh! Topia. So, play along.
Per favore, per favore. Eccolo. Se fossi un ricco uomo, avrei tutti I soldi nel mondo, se uomo ricchissimo.
Kaiba is the protagonist. Through force of will, he turned an arms-dealing company into the #1 trading card game exchange company in the entire world. And he loves dragons. He has a private jet that looks like a dragon.
SETO.
Consider if a teacher fails by their students.
SETO.
This is the last freeze frame. Just think about what Kaiba did to him. Think about how Kaiba sees the world. He doesn't lie. He's not really deceptive. Kaiba believes that by assembling the best trading cards, he can become the best at trading card games, as controlling as many things as possible, limiting as many factors through brute force. There is a limit to this philosophy, which we're going to demonstrate pretty categorically over a single game. This is a pseudo tutorial, so we're going to win no matter what. Rock, paper, scissors is a simple predictive game that, like all predictive games, mostly occurs in the metagame. That is to say, it occurs with more of the actions outside of physical gameplay than within physical gameplay. I picked scissors because Kaiba is good at games, and anybody who's good at games would pick paper if you think they would pick rock. That's how it works. Our hand is bad. Our hand has 2 dinguses and 2 defensive cards. There is no thrust, no verve. That's an absurd card that kills every creature in play. So what we're going to do is we're going to just say, well, maybe our hand can be better. Back in my day, Graceful Charity was top tier velocity generation. In a card game, velocity is saying, let me get where I'm going as quickly as possible. It gives us a direction. So we discard the dinguses, and we keep this really good card and a much cuter dingus in our hand, as well as a card that will trigger an animation later in the duel. Kaiba's weakness as a player is that he sees power one-dimensionally, so watch how many cards he plays this turn. It's going to be pretty cool. He's also going to misplay slightly. It's weird, it's difficult in the game Duel Monsters in kayfabe, Yu-Gi-Oh! In our universe. Well, there's a little reference to a famous rapper presently. But in our universe, it's difficult to sort of assess, should you attack with your larger or your smaller creature? He goes smaller and gets punished. We now take no damage. So look, Kaiba invested in that turn 1, 2, 3, and then the sacrificed creature, 4 cards. Let's spend 1 card. Dark Hole ends the world. He takes a meaningless action of gaining life. I'm not going to do any damage to kill him. I'll do damage to him to prove a point, but to kill him, I'm going to do something goofy. Now, Here's the point of a sword. My favorite Celtics player at the moment is Marcus Smart. When the Wizards were a more competitive basketball team, I liked him less. But if you're not competing against Marcus Smart, you can't but help admire his pluck. But isn't a card game a predictive game in some ways? As we begin our next turn, consider how many cards we have in play and in our hand, and then count those cards for Kaiba. It's a pretty wild ratio in terms of a times table. Yeah, so think about it like that. Maybe we're predicting this like the weather. Okay, we've begun winning the game. This is going to seem extremely silly, but from here on out, it doesn't really matter how I play. I thought this card could maybe steal his monster, and I don't really understand how to interface properly with the video game yet. So I end up doing something that you shouldn't do, just throwing a spell card face down. Meanwhile, this is the play I should have made from the beginning, using this extremely powerful card to press an advantage. We have so many more cards than Kaiba that we might as well spend our cards to generate advantages while we can. This is an aggressive line in the game. Ignore the Celtic Guardian now. Sangan, the 1000 point brawler we have, is a little fiend that when dies is going to get our win condition out of our deck. This is going to seem kind of weird, but it doesn't really matter if we do any more damage to Kaiba. In fact, at some point, we'll probably just start giving him life points out of some sort of mercy rule. Here's an advanced meme theory term, counter-animatic. Did you take your eyes off the Sangan? Now let's start winning the game. Look at that arm. Look at that arm. Look at that head. That's the dude. Exodia the Forbidden One. Those were his arms. He also has 2 legs. So last time, if you remember, it said, you win the duel. Your opponent's life points were reduced to 0 very passive-aggressively. This time, Exodia will have been assembled. That's a spoiler, but like I said, if you had counted the cards, it seemed like the duel might have already been predictable from this point. And now let's think about what that means in terms of how the rest of the game actions occur. 40% victory. So, if Kaiba were truly the best duelist that he knew, he would probably know what Exodia does. And it's interesting to think about, because if once you see this, somebody search their deck for the head of Exodia, you could count the number of cards remaining in their deck and say, 4 of those cards, once drawn, will kill me. Now, Kaiba knows he can't be dead this turn, because you have to have Exodia in your hand or in play. But why would you play Exodia? It doesn't really matter. And look at how terrible his creature is. His creature is smaller than Dark Magician, who recently developed a chain fetish from a trap card sprung by Kaiba, so can no longer attack. And so now we'll just play defense ad nauseum. Those swords in our hand, that sword spell, Swords of Revealing Light, that reveals stuff, but mostly it just plays defense. We've got a knight we could call to our side of the battle, but again, 40% victory. Kaiba should know better. So let's talk strategy. We could use our stalwart elf and our chained fetish Dark Magician to call forth Gaia, the pretty bad knight that's in our hand. It's just too many resources for too little value against a guy who only sees power as the first statistic on a monster card. Dark Hole ends the world. So now we can talk about why Kaiba is playing so poorly, and it's because, again, of this concept I keep borrowing from professional wrestling of kayfabe, which is to say the fiction sustained by the game. So, in kayfabe, Kaiba has probably not lost a lot of card games. He actually got adopted by an arms dealer when he was an orphan, and also got his younger brother adopted through wagering on a chess game. I'm not sure what he wagered against, perhaps just gratifying the ego of a millionaire or billionaire, but he actually makes his company more profitable by switching from arms dealing to the projection, honestly. So again, in kayfabe, this is the first time we've ever played one of those famous giant hologram duels. There aren't a ton of these dual monster cards in existence. Kaiba's Blue Eyes White Dragon, they actually make up 3 of the 4 Blue Eyes White Dragons in all of existence, and the 4th one, that's the driving action of the plot that we're kind of butchering. So think about that animatic of the dragon gliding around, or our counter animatic, and imagine that you had never seen it before, and you were on the recipient, or you were the recipient, I should say, of the dragon. Our Sangan died, and now we're 80% of the way to victory. And you can see sort of the futility in Kaiba's actions, because nothing he does really matters at this point. Now I do what the dominant usually do in situations. I experiment through sacrifice, but not really on my part. If you look, our life points are more than twice as much as SETO's, and we're 80% of the way to victory. We canonically are playing the part of Yami Yugi, and here's a massive spoiler, so cover your ears. Our real name is the Pharaoh Atem, son of Atenakhon, I think? Don't quote me on that. Regardless, we are a historical figure with a strange anime sheen. And if you know anything about the pharaohs, even through the mythology of the Old Testament, or Torah as it should be called most often, you know that the pharaohs, in general, were slave owners. And that's not just something from the Bible, that's just something from history. So, you have to ask yourself, What is the society that they had when they didn't have this hyperbeam projection? Instead of slave owners, I'm going to make an effort to start saying practice slavery because, to be honest, you should always try to improve. So prepare for another demonstration of the limits of power seen in the singular dimension as a philosophy. Let's flip over the card we misplayed earlier. If you create a gun, if Mao Zedong was correct, and political power flourishes and blossoms from those, then you have to make sure you're the only person who can fire it. If you look at Kaiba's chain traps and stuff like that, it makes him look like the only person who can fire it. But you can see, if you invest so many cards in the gun assembly, you're left with so little to defend yourself with upon subsequent turns. So we're just going to begin playing cards. We're just going to begin playing cards. Our cards are powerful, I don't want to pretend they aren't, but if you look in terms of one dimension, the dimension of monsters, Kaiba has made two of the largest monsters. They were not the most important monsters played. And this is the joke of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the joke of Eternal Attack in some ways, which is that the most powerful thing is not in fact the most powerful thing. So consider the card Confiscation that we used to steal the Blue Eyes White Dragon, of which, again, there are now only 3 functional copies in all of existence. The card gives him 1,000 life points every turn. Blue Eyes White Dragon has 3,000 points of damage. Consider that monsters are maybe just instantiated damage in the card game Yu-Gi-Oh! Confiscation is +1 monster, minus 1,000 positive damage, aka minus 1,000 damage. So, consider that. How many turns would we have to control this Blue Eyes White Dragon, and what would Kaiba have to be able to do with his life points to make this a bad trade for us? He sacrificed 2 monsters to summon Blue Eyes White Dragon. It doesn't really matter what we do. His life points are a reservoir of instantiated damage. Each turn a creature can inflict damage positively through its attack stat, or negatively by receiving an attack. Our life points are a reservoir of our participation in the game. Generically speaking, they only matter as they dwindle. You can spend them, but if you spend them, you have to be cognizant of the rate at which they're spent. We are not playing this game particularly well. Let me rephrase that. I did not pilot this game particularly well. The euphemism is that the only life point that matters is life point number 1, or life point number 7,999. We've played so many spell and trap cards we can no longer play cards to that part of the field, and we have 3 face-up spell cards that are just kinda hanging out. Again, 80% of the way to our game plan reaching fruition, Kaiba can have as many life points as he would like. Now that his life doesn't matter, how do we generate value? Whenever we draw a monster that has no ability, the 2 rightmost spell cards we have face up draw extra cards. Remember that monsters are also reservoirs of damage, so manipulating damage by removing and interacting with monsters is akin, though not identical to, manipulating your opponent's life total. Blue Eyes White Dragon, though it's not doing any damage to Kaiba in terms of life total, is destroying cards, which is in fact a much more valuable type of damage. This wolf will never do damage to Kaiba, but it will be valuable in terms of a reservoir of life points. The elf is an extremely valuable life point reservoir.
In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs played a game.
I play Pot of Greed. This allows me to draw 2 more cards from my deck.
I would need to do 10,000 damage to defeat Kaiba via damage. That's more than the number of Blue Eyes White Dragons in existence. He saw to that, but he doesn't really understand how this game works despite being pretty good at it. There is the text and the subtext and the context. Cards are only as valuable as they are in terms of creating you as the winner of the game. Sangan is more powerful than Blue Eyes White Dragon. It has 1/3 of the attack and less than 1/4 of the defense. Let's put it in defense mode to stunt. Now watch me end the world with Dark Hole. Canonically, nobody's ever done this before, but if you could imagine this as a game played by human beings who grew up in a knowingly capitalist system, well, You could imagine a situation where this is just something you want to do. You win. You won using the effects of Exodia the Forbidden One. This is nearly the right moral. Kaiba loses because he only played for power. He exchanged too many cards for attack stats. It's not actually a matter of a heart, though the ancient Egyptians thought the heart was the brain, so consider that whenever they speak about the heart of the cards. Pegasus realization number 2, Pegasus is an anarcho-capitalist. Consider Jay Electronica's release schedule, compare him with Wu-Tang. Imagine a Jay Electronica tape that only Martin Shkreli owns. That doesn't really make sense. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Have you read The Medium is the Massage by Marshall McLuhan? I've read a section of it in college. I turned in a paper for that class that was just the lyrics to the song Born to Lose-Lautrec by New Bomb Turks. It took 32 turns total, 16 of our turns, to win, but I said we would win from the beginning, and it turned out I was right. Please vote Sanders.
SETO.